Urban Cultural Studies,
the podcast.
Interviews.
And welcome to Urban Cultural Studies Podcast.
I am Ben Fraser. Today our guest is Allison Schifani, who is the postdoctoral scholar in the digital humanities at the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Allison's work explores urban intervention and participatory public art with a particular focus on emerging media, technologies, and infrastructures. Welcome to the program, Allison. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Ben. It's lovely to be here.
So you've published an article in the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies titled Alternative Sprawls, Junkcities, Buenos Aires Libre, and Horizontal Urban Epistemologies.
Yes.
You actually traveled to Buenos Aires and met artists, eco-activists, and programmers in the Once neighborhood of the city, and somehow this leads to a moment, perhaps more than one moment, but I'm thinking of how you open your article.
Right.
A moment where you are on top of a rooftop, staring out at the urban cityscape. You describe a rickety metal ladder, wires, cables, personal computers, and an antenna. Help listeners to imagine what you're seeing on this rooftop and perhaps what you're seeing from it.
The Once neighborhood of Buenos Aires is primarily working class. It's also very populous and very busy. From the rooftop of Once Libre, I had a really great view of the city sprawl.
Yeah.
All the moving crowds below, some crisscrossing power and phone lines that link surrounding buildings, and a park space across from the structure that functions as a transportation hub. It is a dizzying and not very orderly view of the city of Buenos Aires.
Yeah, let's talk about that dizzying and not quite ordered notion of sprawl in Buenos Aires. There's an opposition between this central urban core and the city's prolonged 20th century expansion. You write that a third of the total population of Argentina now live in the greater metropolitan area of its capital. I wonder if you could talk about the sprawling neighborhoods surrounding the federal district.
Sure.
And what this means for an autonomous network such as that of Buenos Aires Libre.
Well, Buenos Aires is an enormous city. Nearly 3 million people live there. Mm-hmm. It's also, unsurprisingly, unevenly developed. There are the villas. These are highly impoverished slums that pop up around the city, and they're often without complete infrastructure or any sort of officially approved architecture or building strategies. There are wealthy suburban and urban neighborhoods, and of course there are miles of junk space also, commercial centers, etc. This unevenness, though, is particularly useful for a network like Buenos Aires Libre, whose aim, even though it refuses a particular political goal, is to construct a horizontally organized network, both in terms of its sprawl across the city and in terms of its diversity of membership. Because the network improves with each constructed and connected nodes, users benefit from new nodes in every area of the city, poor or rich, commercial or residential. In that sense, the horizontality of the sprawl helps bring a very diverse group of people and spaces to the table.
And horizontality, of course, as you've just intimated, has a political meaning. It makes sense to talk about the terms Once Libre, Buenos Aires Libre, and the interconnection between technology, social and political activism, for example. What kind of conversations did you have with the people connected to these organizations? What kind of conditions, what kind of ideas led to their formation?
Well, it's important probably to remind listeners that the research that I conducted in Buenos Aires took place over the course of about 6 months, the first half of 2012. Mm-hmm. Buenos Aires Libre is an organization that changes its shape a lot, so I can't really speak on what the group is up to today. But when I was there, spending time on that rooftop and in the building below it, as well as elsewhere in the city, the members and participants of Buenos Aires Libre came to build their own autonomous network apart from the internet for a very large variety of reasons. Some were simply technophiles. They wanted to learn about the building process, about the technology involved. Others had social and political aims. A number of the participants I spoke to were interested in the open source and free software movements. Some were hackers. They wanted a way to utilize network technologies without being mediated or observed by corporate or governmental forces.
And the others?
Others were layman participants who came to the network because they just wanted new ways of communicating in their neighborhoods. And the Buenos Aires Libre network seemed to offer possible low-cost alternatives to other infrastructure, which either didn't reach them or to which they didn't want to connect.
And what about Once Libre?
Once Libre was just one group of people who wanted to put up a node in the network. They were particularly invested in ecology. There was a really great rooftop garden at Once Libre on a deck just below the rooftop. They built a solar oven there. They also held workshops on what they called guerrilla gardening, and they taught local participants how to make seed bombs, things like that. Because Once Libre's work was sort of more distinctly political, there were some members of Buenos Aires Libre who were less than thrilled about the network's participation there.
Was there a conflict of sorts between those who were more interested in guerrilla gardening and those who were more committed to technological activism? Were there people who spanned both of these groups?
There was not, in fact, such a conflict visible among the participants I interviewed. The real division was between those who thought the network had political potential and wanted to openly engage that potential, and those who felt the network should avoid any association with the political realm.
Okay.
The workshops and known building that some Buenos Aires Libre members put on at Once Libre did cause some uproar among those members who felt that any association with Once Libre was necessarily political and thus, for them, ran counter to the insistence on open horizontal organization. They felt that apolitical members or participants or those whose politics were not really compatible with Once Libre would be alienated or discouraged.
Okay, I'm thinking of the documentary film titled The White Train, El Tren Blanco, from 2003.
Definitely.
Viewers of that documentary see people riding the white train from peripheral areas into the center of Buenos Aires at night to pick up cardboard and other recyclable items. They're going downtown to pick up cardboard and other recyclable items in order to collect a meager sum for the value of those materials. You actually mentioned these cartoneros, they're called, at one point in your article.
The cartoneros are a very compelling example of the issues at stake, I think, in an urban ecology like Buenos Aires. Their work is essential to the ongoing function of the city. Without them, I'm sure the municipality couldn't really control the city's waste. But they're also an underclass. The junk that they collect and then sell is recycled into books, into raw materials for new manufacturing. I know that some of the plastics they collect end up as polar fleeces, actually.
Huh, is that right?
On the one hand, they have an impact in the more traditional sense of the ecological. They help move the city's junk out of the streets and back into its production cycles. On the other, any close look at their place in the city indicates some very large global economic and social forces at work. The cartoneros plug into the urban ecology of Buenos Aires in a way that indicates that flows of money, bodies, technologies, and trash are all imbricated in the urban landscape. They arrest the tendency to simplify the urban ecology. You can't just say, recycling is great, we're saving the planet, and get on with your day, because the cartoneros are themselves a kind of junk labor in the city. And as they mobilize certain economies, they are excluded from avenues of upward mobility.
Right, and the spatial structure of the city helps to enforce this exclusion. In the documentary film, for example, the cartoneros live quite far away from the areas where recyclables can be most efficiently collected.
Exactly. Architectures and infrastructures work in tandem to produce and reproduce certain kinds of social relationships.
Yeah.
When I visited the Villas in Buenos Aires, for example, I had to be guided there by members of the community. This, at least, was what my interviewees at Buenos Aires Libre, along with just about everybody else I met in the city, insisted. Conversely, many of the Villas lack communication infrastructure, which might otherwise link them to more affluent communities around the city. In distinct and distinctly spatial ways, class structures and hierarchies are upheld.
What's interesting to me in all this is to see how space is produced in certain interests. You have the historical structure of Buenos Aires, its built environment for both production and consumption, for transportation, and then you have the way that space is used, perhaps even reshaped or at least potentially reshaped in the interests of people who were really not taken into account by that primarily architectural production of the city.
Yeah, I think Michel de Certeau's work in the practice of everyday life is still exceptionally relevant where this is concerned.
Yeah.
He dedicates that text to the everyday pedestrian, writing his own way across the city in ways that tactically respond to the strategies of governments and urban planners.
Exactly.
De Certeau makes really clear that our quotidian articulations of the city can function to destabilize the urban status quo. I see Buenos Aires Libre as really actively engaging and aiming for such alternative ways of knowing and using the city. And what's more, to take de Certeau a little further, is the way in which this alternative network they're building in the city also offers an alternative map of communication infrastructure, a different way of knowing what communication is. When the average user pulls up a web page on their browser, they don't see the infrastructure below their feet or above their heads that makes that kind of interface possible. Some of the city is, and this is not an accident, erased in that interaction. Buenos Aires Libre is deeply invested in the construction of infrastructure and in labor, albeit a sort of DIY for free sort. They help to build a really distinct epistemological milieu, and it makes for a different understanding of city space.
In your article, you point to the importance of physical, material interaction in the building of the Buenos Aires Libre network.
Absolutely.
There is a participatory spirit to both the labor that goes into this and also into the product of that labor.
Buenos Aires Libre is built for and by its users. This, of course, reinforces the horizontality of the network, helping to give every participant, every node, equal footing. But it also offers a distinctly tactile and haptic engagement with city space and communication infrastructure.
Right.
Touching the materials that make up this network, climbing your way to the top of an apartment or office building, putting up a directional antenna in the wind high above the streets. This process means that an autonomous network like Buenos Aires Libre doesn't cover over the materiality of informational exchange. Those, neoliberal myths of ephemerality and instantaneity of the whole world at your fingertips in fractions of seconds. No need for boots on the ground. It just can't fly in the face of the material building process of Buenos Aires Libre.
You look also at Buenos Aires Libre as an organization that is imagining a very different and sometimes a very disastrous future. Is this a new kind of techno-utopianism?
Yeah. Now, not all members of Buenos Aires Libre feel this way, but while I worked with them in Buenos Aires, several did express to me that one possible purpose of the network was to rebuild communications after ecological or political catastrophe. That is indeed the word used on the Buenos Aires Libre website, actually, catastrophe.
Yeah.
And Buenos Aires Libre would, in this scenario, usher in a communication system that's egalitarian, right, and communitarian in this future city they imagine. The utopian has always been aligned with the urban. I point to Gorlick and Silvestri, among others, in my article to ground that point, but you could also think of Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, or in Latin America, La Ciudad Abierta, which is outside Valparaiso, Chile. The members of Buenos Aires Libre who do think about some future utopia do it first, though, by imagining disaster, potentially on a global scale.
A widespread and complete shutdown.
Well, shutdown in this dark vision opens up possibilities for an urban rebuilding. Their utopia is, in this way, very messy. This seems to me a kind of speculative act, particular to the contemporary moment, a response to the failures of the orderly utopia of endless market futures and speedy, abstract information that seems tied closely to the neoliberal project. And maybe it is a kind of techno-utopianism in Buenos Aires Libre, but not of the variety where the technology itself is supposed to liberate us, and not one that ignores the potentially dire consequences of our present actions on the future of our shared cities.
What do you think is the promise or potential of horizontal organizations like these?
In a word, immense. Networks, infrastructural or social or both, that engage horizontal space and horizontal organizational strategies have the capacity to reach across long-standing lines, both spatial and conceptual, that work to maintain structural inequalities. These kinds of organizations are rhizomatic by nature. They offer an opportunity for communication between very diverse groups and actors. And while they might move more slowly than more typical organizations whose forms are arboreal,
right,
they, I think, have more distinct power. I know it's old hat by now to say that capital has adapted and is just as mobile and liquid as anything, but it still depends on particular hierarchies and divides. Horizontality works against exactly those hierarchies and divides, and I, for one, am hopeful that we can build different cities and build our cities differently. Horizontality is very much a methodology that might prove successful in that project.
Thanks for being here, Allison.
My pleasure, Ben. Thank you.
Allison Schifani's article, Alternative Sprawls, Junkcities, Buenos Aires Libre, and Horizontal Urban Epistemologies, is published in the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies 1.3, 2014. Also, be sure to check out Allison's forthcoming article in the online journal Media Fields, as well as usdac.us, the website for the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, which, by the way, has no affiliation with the U.S. government, for whom Allison is helping to build a database of low-infrastructure, high-impact art and community projects. You can also follow her on Twitter, @aschifani.
Remember that you can access the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies in both print and online formats through Intellect Publishers. And make sure to follow our multi-authored blog for more urban discussions at urbanculturalstudies.wordpress.com.